continue with our periodic examination of the things that Father Malachi Martin wrote. And there are some who are now taking a concerted effort to smear his good name. And this has been going on for 40 years. After he wrote his book, The Jesuits, which he later said could have been titled The Religious Orders, wherein he spilled the beans, so to speak, about the actual secrets of the Jesuits, the moral decay within the Jesuit order, a book I highly recommend you read. This is not a work of Protestant historic fan fiction where they turn the Jesuits into the great historic evils with secret oaths to put the entire world under the yoke of the papacy. That makes them sound way cooler than they ever actually were. Rather, he's talking about, in that book, the moral decay within the Jesuits, embodied in our time by the likes of Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church or Pastor Tommy Reese of the Jesuit Church, men who preach a false gospel so virulently and so openly that you can't really say they're Catholic, that they are preaching something else entirely. And this moral decay, as well as other forms of corruption within the Jesuit order, were front and center of a book he called The Jesuits back in the 1980s. And immediately after publishing that book, his name started getting dragged through the mud. The laughable accusations against him. And the accusations against him, complete with evidence that was largely fabricated, were always brought within 1 or 2 degrees of separation from Jesuits. Funny how that works out. And today we have people still repeating those damnable lies about him. And I use that word purposefully because they are bearing false witness against a man who did everything in his power to tell everybody what was going on in the church. And he has become practically a prophet. Not a prophet in the divine guidance sense of the word, but he saw everything that was coming. And he tried to warn everybody. And so that's why this next section which is not even from a book, it's from a radio interview he did in 1996 or 1997, very much near the end of his life. Will make some people uncomfortable. There were 3 popes responsible, Malachi Martin says, for the changes wrought to the church after Vatican II. He uses Vatican II as the pivot point in the church, which it clearly was. But there were 3 popes responsible. John the 23rd, Pope Paul VI, and John Paul II, for implementing the changes to Catholicism that he say were catastrophic. And he goes over here in this interview what the effect has been, not just for the church, but for the world. This is such a long clip that I'll probably bring the next part of it in the future, where he starts talking about Fatima. So Malachi Martin, ladies and gentlemen, in his own words.
Windswept House was published in 1995, July of 1995. It is now coming out in paperback. And we're talking with Father Malachi Martin, who is the author, best-selling author of that book, and other books of interest, The Keys of This Blood, The Final Conclave, and The Jesuits. Welcome to the program, Father. Good evening.
Thank you. It's good to be with you, Michael.
Let me ask you this before we get into the heart of the interview.
Mm-hmm.
Since Windswept House was published in 1995...
This was 1996, Michael.
I'm sorry, 1996.
June 1996.
Okay, since it was published in June of 1996...
Yes.
What has changed?
In what? In the church?
In the church.
The word change is not exactly the word. It would be more accurate if you said to me what has developed or what has decayed, what has gone obsolete, what has, in that sense of change, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Change can be a positive thing, and most of the changes in the Roman Catholic and Apostolic Church since June 1996 have been negative.
They've been negative.
Definitely negative. As an organization, we're going down. We're not going up.
Okay.
And that in most significant ways and insignificant ways. So if you ask me to change in that sense, the general overall remark would be that change is for the worse as regards the organization of the Catholic Church, the institutional organization composed of bishops and priests and dioceses and parishes and religious orders and institutes and schools. The overall picture is a blighted one.
If I may read a quote from Winston Churchill, the thing about conspiracy is interesting. Now, we're going to touch on this, too, because I'm sure this has a large part to play in this.
Yes.
But he said from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx, who is also known as Moses Mordecai Levi,
That's right.
and down to Trotsky, Bela Kun, Rosa Luxemburg, and Emma Goldman, for the overthrow of civilization and for the reconstitution of society on the basis of arrested development of envious malevolence and impossible equality has been steadily growing.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's Winston Churchill.
Yeah.
Now, he refers to a gentleman by the name of Weishaupt.
Yeah.
How much of what is going on in the world today regarding the Catholic Church and the New World Order, how much of this has to do with Adam Weishaupt?
A very great deal, because Adam Weishaupt was a great member of the Lodge,
Uh-huh.
and the Lodge are in the forefront of the general effort to neutralize and offset the influence of the Roman Catholic Church. It's, you know, Michael, when you get down to the point of speaking about conspiracies and plans and plots, of course, you will be laughed out of court because they'll just simply say, well, he is a conspiratorial type. He relies on conspiracies.
Right.
And therefore, it's not a very useful way of describing what's happening in the Catholic Church, especially since you're trying to put the blame in the wrong place. The changes that have taken place in the organization, the institutional organization of the Roman Catholic Church, the changes have been the deliberate work of three popes. John the 23rd, who was Pope from 1958 to 1963, Pope Paul VI, who was Pope from 63 to 78,
Uh-huh.
and John Paul II, who was Pope from 1978 until this day we're talking.
Okay, now,
They introduced the changes. They deliberately did so. And all the devastating changes that have been introduced was directly the work. All of them were directly the work of those three popes. So, I mean, what I'm saying is that no matter what enemies the Roman Catholic Church has, and it has enemies,
mm-hmm.
and who hasn't got enemies, and we have rather a wide swath of enemies all over the world. We have. There's no doubt about that. A lot of them are just free thinkers. A lot of them are other religions like Mormonism, which heartily abhors the Roman Catholic Church,
Mm-hmm.
as do many sections of the Baptistic tradition. And there's a lot of those in America. There are about 90 million Baptists in the United States of different Baptistic traditions.
Right.
But they don't account for the deterioration of the church.
What I guess the thing I want to do when we come back for break is I want to get into what does account for the deterioration of the church, because I think that the audience will be surprised to hear that not only is it working for the deterioration of the Catholic Church, but it has much, much more far-reaching implications. Am I correct?
It's a wide application.
Yes. Before we went to break, we were talking about, the deterioration of the Catholic Church, and we were talking about
As an organization.
as an organization.
Yeah.
Let's talk about why this is occurring.
Yeah. Before we do that, we should make it clear at least I should make my mind clear to our listeners, namely that we make a radical distinction between the institutional organization composed of bishops and priests and dioceses and parishes and institutes and schools and universities and libraries, und so weiter, as our German cousins say. Between that, the institutional organization, and what we call the mystical body of Christ. And what is that? It is the assemblage of all those in a state of grace, what the Roman Catholics call the state of grace. And they are either in heaven, or they're in purgatory, or they're on earth, and they're observant Catholics.
Okay.
There's a distinction between those two elements that make up the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
Now, what is deteriorating is the organization. And the question we've just touched on, the fundamental question is what has caused it. And my remark was that it's our own doing. It was done by us to us. It was done by three popes, followed by their bishops, to the institutional organization. Why? Because of a meeting held in the 1960s, from 1962 to 1965, where a very clever parliamentarily sage group of cardinals and bishops, under the prodding of two popes, decided to draw up a blueprint for the church in the future, which would effectively liquidate the central mystery of Catholicism, which is the Mass, and which would reduce the status of the Pope, and that's a key element, reduce the status of the Pope to the status of the first among equals. And both of those things require explanation, but it was a blueprint drawn up, and it's taken just about 30 years to implement. And Pope John Paul II, the present Pope, he has achieved finally the complete deterioration of the organization itself. Now, you can ask, what is the motive? Why? The motive, I think, is misguided, of course, and was wrong in its calculation. Mm-hmm. But there was a great urge in the 60s at that meeting of the bishops. There were 2,800 of them, by the way, gathered in St. Peter's for 3 years.
Now, this is Vatican II you're talking about.
Vatican II, from 1962 to 1965. The spirit amongst them, and fomented by the popes in question, and by the cardinals, and the cardinals are very important officials around the Pope. The spirit amongst them was, at all costs, at all means, let's get with the world. We've been isolated. We're antediluvian. We are not talking to modern man as modern man understands talk. We're not with him in building his habitat. We've been too busy with our own spiritual matters and theological developments and converting people. Let's take a completely different attitude and let's join the world. And let's modernize everything. And the big word that John the 23rd used was aggiornamento, which means bringing things up to date. Now, that was their spirit. And in order to do that, they jettisoned, in the Vatican Council, they jettisoned sacred traditions that had always been traditions in the Catholic Church back to the time of the first popes in the first century. Peter, Linus, Clatus, Clement, and all the others. Mm-hmm. They jettisoned those and substituted more modern-sounding doctrines, especially on 2 or 3 capital points. One was about human liberty. The other was about marriage, the meaning of marriage, and the purpose of marriage. A third was concerning the Holy Father, concerning the Pope's authority. On those 3 points, they changed completely the organization of the Church. Now, why did they do it? I think it was a mistaken zeal to belong to the modern world, to catch up with it. And we have caught up with it in the sense that, Michael, today, if you study any country at all, even some mess of a country like North Korea or Albania, you'll find that, but in all normal countries, you'll find always there are 3 components, and only 3. The first important component is the government. Government is terribly important nowadays, much more important than it was for our grandfathers and grandmothers. Mm-hmm. And the second component is the business community. And in many countries, it's more important than the government, as in Switzerland and in the United States. Business is it's the fulcrum that moves the whole country.
It's the big thing.
And the third component is what we call that rabble of NGOs, non-governmental organizations. Everything from the International Firemen's Association to Mothers Against Drunk Driving to the Catholic Church and to all the churches. We are just NGOs. And it's a name taken from the United Nations. And we're in the marketplace. We're no longer consulted, especially by anybody. No church is. Religion has very little to do with the way the government is run.
Now, there is an underlying...
Wait till I finish this.
Okay, go ahead.
Now, The change is that the church is now competing in the marketplace and competing with the weapons of competition, not with its spiritual power. Not with its spiritual power.
And therein lies the conflict.
As losing the battle, because the only weapons put in the hands of the church by Christ, who founded the church, are spiritual weapons.
That's it.
So that's where I think the difficulty started. Now, so much so, Michael, that, and this is going to shock some of even our non-Catholic listeners, we have now, the Catholic Church, in its latest statistical index, has just published that Catholics number 1 billion plus.
Wow.
Out of 5 billion, a population of 5.5 billion. And yet, you can safely say, if you're going to be frank, and of course, as the British say, bloody-minded, you're going to tell the truth and say that certainly 2/3 of those Catholics throughout the world, Latin America, Europe, Asia, Australia, Canada, USA, 2/3 are being led by the nose, unknowingly, out of the Catholic faith. Because they're not taught the Catholic faith as it was always taught.
Is this part of we'll answer this after the break, but is this part of a larger grand design by someone?
Well, the only person who really designs history is Christ.
Okay.
He is the king of history.
All right.
The church is in freefall. He says this like 1997. I want you to think about the implications of that, because here we are 30 years later, and he is not wrong. At the very end of that, you heard him say that most Catholics, 2/3 of Catholics in the world, are being led by the nose out of Catholicism, unwittingly, by men in the church. They're being taught a new religion. Now it's much more overt than it was even in that time. Now they call it the New Synodal Church. Synodality being some key component of the gospel, even though you'll never find that in the writings of the church going back to antiquity. But be that as it may, it's more obvious now than at that time. But I'm curious what you think about this. Does it make you uncomfortable hearing him say this about John Paul II, especially if you've read a book like Keys of This Blood? In his book, Keys of This Blood, which was published before Windswept House, he treats John Paul II as almost a prophetic figure, a figure who's going to lead the church in this time of darkness and lead all Catholics and non-Catholics to a closer relationship with God and kind of the rest of it. His attitude about John Paul II here is clearly different at this point, and I can tell you that's just anecdotally. I know a few people. I have spoken with a few people who knew him in life, and they all said the same thing. His attitude about John Paul II changed when he met John Paul II in person. Take that as you will. This is not me attacking John Paul II. This is Malachi Martin just telling you what he thinks about the state of the church. This is why I focus on this channel here on preconciliar figures as a general rule, where the teaching was more solid and more consistent, and the faith was being upheld instead of changed. But I'm curious what you have to say about this. Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It certainly helps. So does sharing this on social media. That helps too. And as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.